fundamental rights define political democracy. None other than Babasaheb Ambedkar also called fundamental rights as the conscience of the Constitution. That among the heart and soul of the entire Constitution, fundamental rights, part 3 is the one that upholds the rights and the dignity of every single citizen. In fact, every single human being within the territory of India. From among all the articles in part 3, Babasaheb Ambedkar held Article 32 as the most important one. That while Article 14, 15, 16 lay down the heart and soul of rule of law and equality before law and equal protection of law and no discrimination based on caste, clan, religion, sex, region, language, etc. And there are other articles which also talk of protection against arbitrary arrest or preventive detention. Each issue is worth a lot of attention. Or also abolition of various titles which were there during British times because they were considered to be the relics of a colonial or a feudal age. Unlike Padma awards which are supposed to be conferred by people of India. It's not the president who confers. President represents people, therefore Padma awards. But all previous articles go on to specify all this. And then Article 19 which defines originally 7 freedoms, eventually they ended up by becoming 6. That's the story we are about to see today. And then Article 21 with right to life, right to dignity, now right to education, etc. Between Article 25 to 30, freedom of religion, freedom of association, following, propagating peacefully one's own religion. And Article 29 and 30, especially 30, defines all kinds of constitutional protections for minorities. But on this background, reason Ambedkar said Article 32 is the single most important, mind you, his words are, he says, if he were asked to pick up one single article from the entire Constitution, then his choice would be Article 32. Because it is under Article 32 that the commonest of a common man can file a suit against government and judiciary has been asked to act as a watchdog for people's rights. So Article 32. And as we saw yesterday, Article 32 deals with various writs which derive from or emanate from Part 3. Wherever there is a challenge to fundamental rights, if fundamental rights are abrogated within the framework of so-called reasonable restrictions, then Article 32. But as we saw yesterday, there are many other rights which derive from the rest of the parts of the Constitution. They get their protection under Article 226. So there are 5, as we saw, 5 kinds of various writs. I need to also clarify that 2 out of those 5 are about the judiciary itself. So this writ called prohibition and the writ called certiorari, 2 out of these 5, these 2 are specifically writs pertaining to the judiciary itself. Prohibition is a negative order for lower judiciary, prohibiting that lower judiciary to proceed with a particular case because even that procedure or the point of law therein abrogates fundamental rights. So it's a negative order. But certiorari happens to be a positive order passed by higher judiciary regarding judiciary or any authority exercising judicial power. We need to be clear about that. So 332 and 226. On balance, all said and done, fundamental rights define political democracy. Directive principles are supposed to define social and economic democracy. These are also the words used by Supreme Court in various cases. that fundamental rights define political democracy and directive principles of state administration define social and economic democracy. For example, some important articles to be noted. It's Article 40 that talks about Panchayat Raj system. And then accordingly we know that while Village Panchayat Act was already existing since British times, a tripartite Panchayat Raj system was created in India beginning with 1961-62. So in order to implement Article 40, democratic decentralization, genuine power to the people, also the genuine Gandhian concept, and most of Gandhian concepts themselves are deep-rooted Bharatiya concepts. So, creation of the political institutions called Panchayat Raj. Government appointed Balwant Rai Mehta Committee by 1955-56. The committee submitted. There were earlier committees, which I'm just just mentioning that there were earlier, but choosing not to spend time on them because the most important one happens to be Balwant Rai Mehta Committee. The Balwant Rai Mehta Committee recommended three-tier structure for Panchayat Raj institutions. Village or Gram Panchayat at village level, Taluka Panchayat or also Panchayat Samiti at Taluka level, and Jilla Parishad at district level. And then Jilla Parishad Panchayat Samiti Act was passed. As far as India is concerned, Rajasthan, then followed by Andhra, are among the first of the states to start implementing Panchayat Raj system. Maharashtra soon followed under the leadership of Yashwantrao Chauhan. So Maharashtra also has its own Jilla Parishad Panchayat Samiti Act of 1961-62. And the actual implementation of Jilla Parishads in Maharashtra started from 1962. Unfortunately, Panchayat Raj institutions could not be said to have worked well, at least until 1992-3. It's a very complex issue, and today I'm making a choice of not going deeper there, because let me repeat, hopefully for one last time in today's session, that even if you pick up this single issue of Panchayat Raj institutions, it is worth a session of 2 hours. And at the end of those 2 hours, I will say that here was introduction. Now you go on studying on your own. So we are just seeing the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. Various states made different arrangements for implementing Panchayat Raj systems. For example, generally the North Indian states placed Jilla Parishads under the collector. Now, administratively speaking, the post of collector traditionally was captain of the district, was first among the equals, but he was supposed to be leader of the administration, that single chain of command. At the district level, collector was the head of all administration. During British times, the role of collector was mainly regulatory. So collector's main role was maintenance of law and order. That role undergoes a fundamental change after independence, that now the main role of administration itself, and therefore collector as the linchpin of administration, the very main role is now development. But there is a system design structured to achieve a particular goal. If the system design remains the same, and you expect the same design to now deliver different results, that's not going to happen. That is what that's what turned out to be the problem for Indian administration. The whole institution of collector and administration predominantly focused on revenue and police, with the overall main upbringing for maintenance of law and order. And now you suddenly start telling them that we are independent now, it's no more British rule, your job is implementing developmental schemes. They are not trained for it, they are not geared for it. And then comes the Panchayat Raj system with the goal of democratic decentralization, involving people in the developmental process. It is development from the bottom, etc. So the original national extension schemes, the original actually community development plan, initially in the first 5-year plan started for 50 blocks, then gradually extended in form of national extension program, and by the end of first 5-year plan, it was extended to all blocks, that is talukas, in the entire country. By that time, Balwant Rai Mehta committee had submitted a report, and then a 3-tier structure comes into existence. By putting Jilla Parishad structure under the government, developmental functions were given a secondary place. In northern part of the country, Chief Executive Officer of Jilla Parishad was considered to be under the collector. And then around 1979, Parliament passed the law for District Planning and Development Councils, DPDCs, another experiment in democratic decentralization, that we should prepare a plan at the district level. And Jilla Parishad should be involved. All departments within the state should be involved. District Guardian Minister will be ex officio chairman of the committee, and collector will be ex officio member secretary of the committee. There will be a district planning officer of the rank of deputy collector, that is class 1 officer, working as district planning officer. And his task will be to coordinate the plan for the district. And then it is DPDC, District Planning and Development Council, which is supposed to deliberate upon that plan, finally prepare, pass, and then send it to the state government. And one meeting for every 3 months is supposed to be conducted. Other rest of the meetings in the year are to monitor the implementation of DPDC. So all very lofty idea. But it so happens that DPDC superimposed itself on Panchayat Raj institutions. So there already was a tripartite Panchayat Raj system, and on and above that Panchayat Raj system came DPDC. The president of Jilla Parishad was also ex officio vice president of DPDC. But all MLAs also and MPs also are ex officio members of DPDC, plus 2 members of NGOs, voluntary organizations, to be co-opted over there. So suddenly DPDC became a superimposing structure over Panchayat Raj systems. Then around the same time, 78-79, the Parliament passed another legislation named District Rural Development Agency, DRDA. District Rural Development Agencies, DRDAs. This is an all-India act, and as the name indicates, this is an arrangement for devolving central government funds directly to the district level. Otherwise, generally under the constitutional structure, central government funds would be sent to the state government, and then the state government would decide how to distribute them across districts. But with DRDA and those rural development plans called Integrated Rural Development Program, IRDP, and very many others. There was TRISEM, Training of Rural Youth for Self-Employment, and many such programs. They were Government of India programs. And to enable union government to devolve funds directly to the district level, DRDAs were created. And each DRDA in each district was to be headed by, again, class 1 officer called project director, PD. He was to be called project director. In some of the North Indian states, those states made a decision of having project director as an IAS officer. And even project director and DRDA itself was placed under collector. So even with your age and the so-called lack of experience, I suppose, even with common sense, you can actually begin to see that the institution of collector, which is essentially designed, which was essentially designed to look after like law and order and regulatory functions and revenue functions. So it was mainly the land revenue collection, etc. now has so many things imposed, offloaded on the same institution. So the Panchayat Raj institutions also placed under the collector. District Planning and Development Council again under the collector. And now DRDA also in the North Indian situation. After careful study, I am convinced that actually Maharashtra made right kind of decisions. Maharashtra did not place Chief Executive Officer of Jilla Parishad under the collector. That is, Panchayat Raj systems were not placed under the collector. Under the laws, that is Jilla Parishad Panchayat Samiti Act and Village Panchayat Act, there are specific sections that confer power upon the collector, which is all okay. For example, conducting elections within the district was entrusted to the collector, which is all okay. But in terms of the power and authority to implement developmental schemes, that was entrusted to Jilla Parishad. And the executive head of Jilla Parishad, that is the CEO. Maharashtra made a choice of having him as an IS officer. That kind of underlines the importance of the institution, and he was not placed under the collector. Collector and CEO both were placed under divisional commissioner. So like 10-15 years senior, and the divisional commissioner from administrative point of view would write confidential reports for both of them. This arrangement ensures autonomy of functioning for Jilla Parishad system. And then when DRDAs came in, Maharashtra again made a choice of posting an MPSC officer. So class 1 years deputy collector ranking as the head of project DRDA, and DRDAs in Maharashtra were attached to Jilla Parishads because their main task was implementing developmental program. Among so many others, this is the reason why Panchayat Raj institutions are comparatively better implemented in Maharashtra. By 1992, Panchayat Raj institutions almost all over India were practically defunct. Panchayat Raj institutions in North India were actually defunct. Two states that did well were Gujarat and Maharashtra. And then Karnataka, around 1985, under the political leadership and vision of Ramkrishna Hegde, the leader of Janata Dal, had come up with another visionary program of integrating all developmental functions at district level and posting a very senior IAS officer to head all developmental programs. That was called the Chief Secretary of the state, of the district. And he was authorized to coordinate all developmental programs at the district level. I must tell you that I was personally convinced that this was a very right direction. This came to be known as Karnataka pattern. And this was a very right direction of giving priority to developmental function, making regulatory and law and order functions not only secondary, but they were supposed to serve the developmental function. So Karnataka had come up with this otherwise a very creative experiment, but the way our politics goes, after Ramkrishna Hegde, nobody cared for it. The whole experiment practically collapsed, and it's everything back to square one. Similarly, Andhra Pradesh, under the leadership of N.T. Ramarao of Telugu Desam, also had begun to implement in mid-80s a plan called Mandal concept. It was that Mandal has nothing to do with the Mandal of Mandal Commission. You are okay to say that that Mandal may have something to do with Chanakya Mandal. This is actually a PJ, but I could actually see so many of you now expecting this, which is not the mark of a joke. Something expected is not a joke. Joke is when something utterly unexpected suddenly comes out of blue and it hits us. But I felt like obliging some of you. You were expecting like next sentence is Chanakya Mandal. My general approach is to avoid PJs. So whenever I crack a PJ, I have to say that this is actually a PJ. By calling NTR's Mandal plan, comparing it with Chanakya Mandal, I have just honored NTR and Telugu Desam. But the idea was a cluster of villages were brought together and they were called a mandal. All regulatory, developmental functions, etc. were brought together under that mandal. And again, a senior IAS officer was posted to head administration over there. Again, after careful study, those days, this is mid-80s, I was personally convinced that this is also one creative step, and again, unfortunately, it has not survived. Then Maharashtra had gone to the extent of appointing a special committee to look into functioning of Panchayat Raj institutions and make recommendations. That is known as Panchayat Raj Committee. You would do well to remember that actually there is one standing legislative committee also called Panchayat Raj Committee at Vidhan Sabha level. Now don't mix that up with this Panchayat Raj Committee. We better remember that as Patil Committee. And it's also referred to as Patil Committee report. This was MLA Patil from Sangli, the head and an educational thinker of the institution. He picked up the name Shanti Niketan. The report is indeed very deeply well studied and lyrical one. The long and short of the report is that even Maharashtra has rare reason to be satisfied about implementation of Panchayat Raj institutions in India, in Maharashtra. But yes, so looking at the overall all India performance, we seem to have done better. But Patil Committee came up with many recommendations to improve the functioning. And Maharashtra had started implementing those recommendations even before the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment. The 73rd and 4th Constitutional Amendment finally came in 1993. Maharashtra had already started implementing the Patil Committee report. Fact of the matter is, actually just before 1992, somehow Jilla Parishad structure even in Maharashtra was de facto defunct. But then the Jilla Parishad elections happened in 1992. 1/3 reservations for women. Eventually the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendments came in. They are respectively for rural and urban local self-government institutions. So rural local self-government institutions naturally mean the tripartite Jilla Parishad structure, that is Panchayat Raj structure. Urban would mean municipalities and then municipal corporations. So 1/3 reservations for women. An election commission at the state level, not as a branch of the Election Commission of India under Article 324. No. This was an election commission for the state. Now this comes up as a constitutional body. Before 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment, the states used to have state election commissions. And of course, they were headed by senior IAS officers, but they were considered subordinate to Election Commission of India. They were officers of Election Commission of India. Now that administrative arrangement may continue, but with 73rd and 74th Amendment, the Constitutional State Election Commission now comes into being with the specific responsibility of conducting free and fair elections regularly, and that regularity was defined at rate of once every 5 years for local self-government institutions. So the State Election Commissions as constitutional body have all the powers and all the duties to conduct free and fair elections for all local self-government institutions. Until these amendments, elections to local self-government bodies were not required to be at regular interval. There was no statutory, no constitutional binding. They may happen, they may not happen. The bodies may be different. Administrators would be appointed on finding that the body is dissolved. For example, like those years, I happened to have the opportunity of being Chief Executive Officer of Ratnagiri Jilla Parishad. The year was 1991. Now, Ratnagiri district was divided into two districts of Ratnagiri and Sindhudurga back in 1979. That division had rendered Ratnagiri Jilla Parishad irrelevant, because now it's two districts. It's not like the Jilla Parishad for the remaining part of original Ratnagiri district continued. Because the districts were divided, Jilla Parishads were dissolved. And then from 79 to like 1991 when I was CEO, there was no elected body neither for Ratnagiri district nor for Sindhudurg district. Then there is a legal provision that when the elected body does not exist, the government officer, that is CEO, derives all the powers of elected body. That is, so general body, standing committee, other 5-6 committees that are supposed to, they are all the powers are with, he's called the administrator. Then he's not just CEO, he's the administrator. But the picture remains that Panchayat Raj institutions had practically grown like defunct. And then now 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments make it constitutionally mandatory upon the State Election Commission to conduct elections to local self-government institutions at regular intervals of once every 5 years. And of course the elections have to be free and fair. There are some cases that happened with respect to Tamil Nadu, a couple of other states, and the worst part of it was also Maharashtra. At a point of time, Maharashtra Assembly passed a breach of privilege motion against the State Election Commissioner and sentenced him to 2 days in jail. And the State's Election Commissioner, the constitutional body, mind you, was physically picked up from his office, taken over to Arthur Road Jail, where the senior IAS officer Nandalal had to spend a whole night. And then the next day morning, the Chief Minister, in his wisdom, that was Vilasrao Deshmukh, he said he has already technically spent 2 days. He was taken to the jail yesterday, spent the night, and we were not happy to do this, so we are releasing him. It was a very foul case. Elections to Jilla Parishad, Panchayat Samitis and municipal bodies had happened. And then government thought that now elections within the body will now be conducted by local administration. So it's like the chairman or the president is to be elected, various committees are to be elected, and the chairpersons of those committees are to be elected. Mr. Nandalal, as Maharashtra's State Election Commissioner, took a stand that it is my prerogative and it is my authority to even conduct these elections. I must tell you that he was not wrong. He placed his finger on the wording in the constitution that all elections to local self-governments. He brought to the notice of assembly and the government at that point of time that the constitutional amendment says all elections. So all means even internal elections. But then some political plans were going haywire. Because as is the truth, for elections within those bodies, there is all kinds of, hanky-panky, all horse trading, all like, if it is open ballot or secret ballot, and suddenly you have the State Election Commission, a constitutional body, conducting even internal elections, the political plans were going haywire. So the government tried to convince Mr. Nandalal, that is the state chief election, he would have none of it. The assembly passed breach of privilege motion against the state's election commissioner, sentenced him to jail without giving him an opportunity to also remain present in the assembly, mind you. The ruling was passed in his absence, and police were ordered to pick him up at around 4:30 p.m. By that time, actually, he was a retired officer, an old man having some medical conditions. He was actually requesting the police to let him pick up proper comfortable clothes from home, maybe proper food from home, and he has his medicines, etc. But like more loyal than the king, police won't listen to that. He was taken over to Arthur Road Jail, spent a night at jail, and the next day morning, then Chief Minister Vilasrao Deshmukh declared that whatever happened, we are sorry, but now we are releasing him. And actually a very sad constitutional chapter from history of Maharashtra. 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments strengthened local self-governments, further empowered local self-governments, gave extra powers to Gram Sabhas also. So that becomes another step in the right direction of empowering people, and Gram Sabha is an example of direct democracy. So Article 40 sees this broad shape in the country. Then Article 45, which was free and compulsory education till age of 14, was eventually, देर से आए पर दुरुस्त आए, turned into Article 21A, where now primary education is a fundamental right, and accordingly there is Right to Education Act also passed. There is Article 48 which is being discussed in the country, because Article 48 talks about protection to cows and milch animal, Go Rakshan. And when this issue about overall like beef and Hindu sentiments etc. is in the picture, some of the states have passed laws banning killing of cows and selling, purchasing etc. of beef, which has been made into a criminal offense in the states including Uttar Pradesh and so also Maharashtra. This has become, or I want to say it has been unnecessarily made into a controversy. All that needs to be done is to point out Article 48, that the founding fathers of the Constitution handed this over as the responsibility of the state, that cows and milch animal is to be protected. In terms of Constitution, there is no banning of cow slaughter, mind you, Go Hatya Bandi. There is no Go Hatya Bandi. The term doesn't exist. Constitution asks the state to in fact Go Samvardhan. So there is no question of like, so to say, banning or something cow. It's more on the positive side. I hope you are getting my point. The Constitution is more on the positive. Constitution asks the state to take every step to develop cows and all kinds of milch animal. That is Article 48. Then of course, probably the most relevant today and also equally, according to me, unnecessarily controversial article is 44. That is Uniform Civil Code. So as I said the other day, when India accepted Indian Penal Code in 1860, all Indians, irrespective of like their religion etc., agreed to abide by uniform criminal law. So predominantly under the law there are two areas or two sections or two parts of any law. There is criminal law and there is civil law. With the implementation of Indian Penal Code from 1860, India accepted uniform criminal law. And that did not create a situation of Islam khatre mein hai. As a part of natural evolution, it was expected that now with independent India, there will be one country, one law. And yes, you are allowed, there is freedom of religion, etc., etc. But when you stay within the territory of this country, this is one single law that every single Indian citizen will be subjected to. I suppose everyone understands without any further explanation that this is probably one of the strongest instrument of national integration, a modern instrument of national integration. So when the issue was being discussed on the floor of the Constituent Assembly, like I have already stated, most of the founding fathers agreed and they had presumed that Uniform Civil Code would come. But I'm going to say, unfortunately, some leaders of minority community, again not all, but some, and self-appointed leaders of Muslim community opposed Uniform Civil Code. British rulers in their wisdom had brought the Sharia Act in 1937. It is an act passed in under our council, in the Viceroy's Council, that was based on Sharia. And these self-appointed leaders of Muslim community in India, the members of Constituent Assembly, argued that Uniform Civil Code will be detrimental to Islam because the law for Islam is Sharia and it is given in the 7th century directly by God to God's last and the greatest messenger, that is Prophet, that is Muhammad Paigambar, peace be upon him. So we will not abide by any law other than that God-given law. So man-made law, the rational law is not acceptable to us. For us, Sharia is the law. The Constituent Assembly chose to respect their feelings and not impose uniform civil code against the wishes of a particular section of Indian society. But Constituent Assembly also in its wisdom chose not to forget the subject. Therefore, Article 44 is there. And I repeat, we would do well to remember that every single word that is there in the Constitution is because the Constituent Assembly agreed unanimously. Unanimously. So it is 292 versus 0. If Article 370 about Jammu Kashmir is temporary provisions with respect to the state of Jammu Kashmir, it is there with unanimity, including the members of Jammu Kashmir, including Sheikh Abdullah himself. Similarly, Article 44, that okay, we will not impose uniform civil code now, but the founding fathers directed the government, the state shall endeavor to create consensus and take active steps so that all communities are taken into confidence, the consensus is built, and once there is that national consensus, there will be voluntary acceptance, and then uniform civil code will be brought in. We know that for a long time it remained dead letter. There was no attempt whatsoever to start to implement it. Then we have seen that on finding that uniform civil code can't come in, Ambedkar saw it as his dream and also his greatest gift to India to bring in that modern, rational, scientific law for the majority community, that is Hindu, and that Hindu as defined under Article 25. So eventually, although it could not come in until he was still alive, Hindu Code Bill finally did come in and has since been followed. There was a little opposition within Hindu society for Hindu Code Bill, but majority of the Hindus were all open and flexible for this modern law. And since then, we know that Hindu Code Bill is implemented with no obstruction, etc. Then there has been an attempt to put in place secular laws, as they could be called. So while there is Hindu Succession Act, and Sharia defines different principles for succession, Warsa Hakka, for Muslims, but there is Indian Succession Act, which is irrespective of one's caste, clan, religion, etc. Similarly, there is Hindu Marriage Act, and then the principles of marriage are governed quite differently under like Sharia or similarly under the Christian law. But there is independent secular that doesn't concern with any religion, etc. That is Indian Marriages Act. So there is a statutory structure put in place, and acceptance of Indian Succession Act, Indian Marriage Act, etc. has been made voluntary. So one can say that there are these informal and to be accepted voluntarily steps to bring about the Uniform Civil Code. It so happens that the state of Goa is formally the first state in the country to actually implement Uniform Civil Code. So Goa has Uniform Civil Code. And as I am expecting most of you to remember that there is a substantial Christian population in Goa which did not oppose and which does not think that because there is Uniform Civil Code, Christianity khatre mein, and we will not abide by that. But somehow minorities, but especially Muslims in India, and not again all Muslims, I know that actually I would venture to say that most of the Muslims are mentally, psychologically okay with Uniform Civil Code. In fact, at personal level, they already follow that the expected Uniform Civil Code, but it suddenly becomes the matter of religion, and the Mullah Maulvi lobby or the lobby of political leaders tries to convince them and then amass the strength behind that thought that by having Uniform Civil Code somehow the identity of Muslims in India will be endangered and they will not survive as a separate identity at all. It is on this background that the Shah Bano case came up as a landmark judgment. Advocate Muhammad Ahmad Khan, a practicing advocate in Indore, divorced his wife for like over 35 or 40 years. She was Shah Bano. When Advocate Muhammad Ahmad Khan divorced her, she was actually a grandmother. And Muhammad Ahmad Khan used provisions from Sharia, or he argued that these are provisions from Sharia, that is Teen Talaq, the oral talaq. That you just say, orally you say talaq, 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 and it's end of the marriage. She was driven out. She preferred a case in Indore District Court. That I don't have independent source of income, and therefore under section 125 of Criminal Procedure Code, the husband is responsible for my maintenance. Muhammad Ahmad Khan opposed it, saying section 125 of Criminal Procedure Code is not applicable to me. I am governed by Sharia Act, and under the Sharia, oral talaq also is acceptable, and I don't owe anything to her once the talaq goes into action. There are two terms we need to understand here. A Muslim marriage is a contract, mind you. So when the marriage happens, the groom and people on his side are required to assign either some amount or some part of the property for as meher. And under Islamic law, the bride is the lawful owner of that either, like I said, amount or some property, meher. Islamic law says that meher is as a gesture of respect for the bride. Islamic law doesn't say that it has something to do with divorce. But if the marriage ends either by death of the husband or divorce, and divorce is acceptable for Islamic law, then because she is the legal owner of that amount or property, it should be handed over to her. So it's not like meher is something to be given over to the Muslim wife at the time of divorce. So there is an arrangement for meher. And this overall issue of oral talaq, is it applicable or not, that we are trying to we are still actually looking at it only on the surface of it. Whether oral talaq is constitutional or not, and whether oral talaq is there in Sharia, does it have a sanction of Sharia or not. But when it comes to section 125 of Criminal Procedure Code, while the civil law may be different for different religions, the criminal law has been uniform since 1860. And section 125 of CRPC says that the earning member of the family in Indian social setup, that generally turns out to be the man, the male person, has the responsibility of the entire family, dependent family, those who do not have independent source of income. So if wife doesn't have an employment, or if after even the divorce, the wife either doesn't have her sources of income or doesn't get remarried, until then she is still the responsibility of the husband under section 125. Therefore alimony, potgi, the maintenance is to be awarded. So Muhammad Ahmad Khan tried to argue that I'm not covered under section 1, it's not applicable to me. His argument was, therein comes the second term into picture, second term under Islamic law we need to understand, and that is iddat. Iddat is a 3-month period after divorce. That under Islamic law, so it is said that once oral talaq goes into action, the husband is responsible for maintaining wife for at the most 3 months, that is period of iddat. And once that period is over, she is on her own and the husband has no responsibility whatsoever. But the Indore District Court did not buy these arguments and ordered a monthly alimony of 25 rupees. This was back in late 70s. But it is still a paltry amount, mind you. But the amount wasn't important. the point of law upheld by Indore District Court became important. So Muhammad Ahmad Khan preferred a writ to the High Court. High Court in Madhya Pradesh is at Jabalpur. So the Jabalpur High Court heard the case, confirmed the District Court decision, and increased Shahabano's alimony to 179 rupees. Some of you are quite rightly laughing at it because even that amount is pretty small. But Muhammad Ahmad Khan went in appeal to the Supreme Court, and then an 11-member bench heard the case. This headed by Justice Y.V. Chandrachud himself. That decision was given in 1984. Supreme Court upheld the decisions by both lower courts. And in passing the judgment, Supreme Court went on to make two observations. In the body of the judgment, make two observations. One, if there is a conflict between the Constitution and Sharia, the Constitution shall prevail. That is, the provisions within Constitution and Sharia, they do not agree. Please remember that in Shahabano case, the Supreme Court also actually argued that oral talaq is un-Islamic, that it's not supported by Quran or Hadith or Sharia, and it's only a custom, pratha, created and further perpetuated by Mullah Maulvi lobby, and it's an archaic remnant of a patriarchal, a male-dominated system which always kept women subjugated. So one argument was that it's un-Islamic. But Supreme Court made it clear in its ruling that should there be a conflict in the Constitution and Sharia within the territory of India, the Constitution shall prevail. And it so happens that there wasn't a single Muslim member on the bench. So when Shahabano case decision came on, and the second point, the second important part of this decision was, the Supreme Court did not just stop by confirming lower court decisions or by ruling that in the event of conflict between the Constitution and Sharia, the Constitution shall prevail. Supreme Court went to the extent of reminding Government of India and the Parliament that your responsibility is Article 44. The Shahabano case decision states it in so many words that it's a great regret that Article 44 has remained a dead letter. And it directed Lok Sabha and Union government to take active steps to implement Uniform Civil Code. This was actually a great opportunity, and government should have picked it up. It was Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, with even I would like to say that impeccable modern credentials on his side, and when this was happening, he also enjoyed this impeccable image as Mr. Clean. In the immediate aftermath of the case, he upheld the decision. He welcomed the decision. On the floor of the Parliament, he asked one of his most trusted friends, actually, he was a cabinet minister in Rajiv Gandhi's ministry, Arif Muhammad Khan. They were classmates from Doon School. And then Arif Muhammad Khan, one of the most learned authorities on Islamic law in India, even till today, mind you, fortunately he is alive. Every once in a while he comes to Pune, and whenever he comes to Pune, I get to meet him. But Rajiv Gandhi asked Arif Muhammad Khan to justify Shahabano case decision by the Supreme Court. And on the floor of Lok Sabha, Arif Muhammad Khan gave a fiery and a very well-studied speech explaining why this is a great step, why all of us, irrespective of our personal caste, clan, religion, etc., we should welcome this decision, why this is not a danger to Islam, like Islam खतरे में, अगर कहीं इस्लाम सबसे ज़्यादा सुरक्षित है तो वो इंडिया में है. That was Arif Muhammad Khan saying even then. Fortunately, there are some mullahs and maulvis also who say it even today. They are office bearers of the Organization of Maulvis in India, Jamiyat-e-Ulema-e-Hind. The organization is called Jamiyat-e-Ulema-e-Hind. Their secretary is Hazrat Madani. And Hazrat Madani has repeatedly stated that there is no danger to Islam in India and we should accept the modern law. Another such great person is Maulana Wahiduddin Khan. It's largely the political interest, the voting behavior and the way our politics works that somehow this, if I may say, Muslim separatism or the phobia that Islam khatre mein hai, is upheld. But Arif Muhammad Khan explained it. That was a great debate. I personally continue to remember it till this date. Eventually, later on, Arif Muhammad Khan has also written a fascinating book named Text and Context. It is a careful, original study of Islamic law and how it relates to all modern versions and principles, including that oral talaq, there is no provision for oral talaq. Not only that it is unconstitutional, but it is also un-Islamic. And he cites original ayat are shloka, ayat are original parts of Quran, where God asked the Prophet to tell the believers to follow the law of the land. Wherever they live, you honestly follow the law. So he has cited all. It's a very classic work. Shah Bano in 1985 would have actually taken India forward by leaps and by bounds. But Rajiv Gandhi and his government, which was actually enjoying massive majority in the parliament, he had 415 seats in a house of 523. So how I wish he should have shown the courage, and he had no reason to be worried about his political position and about elections, blah, blah, blah. But it is the MP G.M. Banatwala from Kerala, the Malabar region. And he formed a lobby, and some 25 Muslim MPs, along with some other mullahs and Maulvis, met Rajiv Gandhi and demanded repealing of this Supreme Court decision. And they said, otherwise we are going to take a movement throughout India and it will cost you Muslim vote. Rajiv Gandhi fell for it. This is a major downfall actually, and climb down. And on May 4, 1986, the law named as Muslim Women's Bill was passed. But that law overturned the Shah Bano case decision. This law claims, the words into bracket are protection for Muslim women, protection for divorced Muslim women. But it takes the jurisdiction of courts out and modern law out, and divorce provisions are to be governed by Sharia, and a Muslim woman will have to approach the Muslim Waqf board, which is headed by mullahs and Maulvis. She was practically made dependent on the Muslim Waqf board, not only ruled by Muslim mullahs and Maulvis, but by men predominantly. That is where it has been until like couple of months ago. We know that 5 Muslim women, including Shaira Bano, now the case is famously known as Shaira Bano case, wherein the Supreme Court held by a margin of 3-2. So it was a 5-member bench headed by Chief Justice, but 3 members ruled that oral talaq is unconstitutional. One of those 3 also stated that it is also un-Islamic. But all 3 unanimously also stated that it is unconstitutional, accordingly declared talaq as unconstitutional and directed the government to form proper laws to protect Muslim women. And then this government has kept that word, and within like the next 6 months, the draft of such a law has been presented. Now it is like either truly or made into a controversy, but that is on, and rest is to be seen. But in the meanwhile, various Supreme Court cases from Shah Bano to Shaira Bano, the Supreme Court made a conscious choice of not touching another 2 provisions which are equally important. In fact, they are interlinked. There is no point in just declaring oral talaq as unconstitutional unless polygamy and this horrible, I am already saying a horrible custom called nikah halala, unless these 2 are dealt with, there is no point in an exclusive decision regarding oral talaq. So, because now it is declared unconstitutional, there may not be oral talaq. But then husband will start neglecting that wife, because under Sharia, Muslim husbands are allowed to have 4 marriages. It's not like Muslim men have been asked to do 4 marriages. They have been allowed to do 4 marriages. And in fact, there is a historical background to that. Before Muhammad Paigambar's historic work in early 7th century in the Arabian Peninsula, various Arab tribes would almost regularly, incessantly be at a violent fight with each other. And it was a regular norm that the tribe that would win would actually massacre the men and rape women. So the Prophet said, you will not be unjust to women, you will marry them. Which was the contemporary way of saying that they should be given a respectable position in society. Therefore, the provision that Muslim men may marry 4 times. Plus, actually, there are very many provisions also. It's like talaq, and so much is controversial about it, whether it is orally there or not. And if it is there, actually there is a system which has been laid down. It's not like one just stands up, the husband, and in a fit of anger or whatever, simply tells the woman, talaq, talaq, talaq. At best, even if oral talaq is to be upheld, the husband is supposed to say talaq at a distance of 1 month from each other. So if he has, unfortunately again, one thing to be noted is, under Islamic law, only men have right to talaq, right to divorce. Women do not have right to divorce. There are Islamic countries which have brought about reforms, but they say they are Islamic countries, that is Darul Islam. So like Iran, there are divorce laws in Iran, so much so that Iran permits women also to file for divorce. So equal rights. And by now I am convinced that right now Saudi Arabia itself is undergoing major changes. I am expecting you to have noticed that last week the present king of Saudi Arabia, Salman is his name, and for a change he is good Salman. Some Salmans are sometimes good. So last week he issued an official order that Muslim women are not under any compulsion to wear niqab and hijab and the full like burqa as we call. This is actually, from Islamic point of view, this is a very radical and a great social reform step that he has taken. We need to also carefully observe how it unfolds over there in Saudi Arabia. But in terms of Sharia, even if oral talaq is to be conferred, the word is supposed to be mentioned 3 times at a distance of 1 month each. Okay, and that too, not at home or in a fit of anger or something. That if the husband now wants to say talaq, there is a methodology that is laid down. That man and wife together are supposed to go to the namaz on Friday, Jummeh ka namaz, which is like holier within Islam. So they are supposed to go to Jummeh ka namaz, offer namaz first, and having done that, then meet the Maulvi of that masjid. State their problem, why they are fighting, etc. Why they want to separate, why husband wants to say, I want to divorce my wife. Then the custom directs the Maulvi to try to reconcile the man and wife first. He's not supposed to take pleasure in breaking them away. His task is, he's supposed to like try to explain to them, don't fight like this, okay? Hatat hat galun ja rastyaani, etc. They don't agree. If after that, okay, then he says, okay, you may pronounce the word talaq, but go home. Stay together. Come back after 1 month. Then if even after 1 month the same procedure is followed, then talaq, saying talaq second time around, and then finally. I think, irrespective of the narrow interpretations of religion, I actually see a lot of psychology behind all this. Okay? Some or many of you may not have experienced anything like this. And personally, I haven't. Before I say or rest of the things I'm telling you, I haven't. But I know that we are all human beings, prone to anger. And sometimes either man or wife, or in the fit of anger, they say things they don't mean, and they repent later on. So this is like a psychological arrangement that, okay, you had a fight, and you want to say something, but you are not allowed. Under the religious law, you are not allowed to say that word here. Two of you should go together to masjid on Friday. So if the fight happens on Saturday, it's almost you have to wait for 1 full week. Most of the fights would end within that week. And they won't even go to the mosque by that time. But if you feel like then go to the mosque. It's offer the prayer. After all, what is namaz? It is remember God and offer the prayer. Maybe the mind settle down. You find some peace. And maybe two of them get up and decide not even to go to Maulvi. They laugh at each other. They laugh at the reason they were fighting. And they say, we are going to go home together. Probably enjoy pav bhaji or tandoor chicken, whatever you want to eat that evening. But if they then go in front of Maulvi, then the guidance for the Maulvi. And this way 3 months. But unfortunately, it is the undoing of all human beings and all religions. Many wrong practices enter. And interested parties start saying that they have a religious backing. And it's like caste system in Hindu society, let me tell you, without taking any further time. I am telling you firmly that there is no religious basis and no religious backing whatsoever for caste system in Hindu society. And it's my open challenge to discuss this with anyone. But like one can't deny the fact that there is caste system and there is casteism in the larger Hindu society, all Indian society. There are caste in Muslim society in India also. There are caste in Christian society in India also. There are caste in Sikh society. There are caste even among Lingayats, mind you. So it's a bane, it's a curse on Indian society. But it's not like it is backed by original religious principles. It becomes a power struggle. So similarly, the issue of like oral talaq. But like we are seeing, there is no point in exclusively dealing with oral talaq, because even if there is only oral talaq, in previous cases, like I said, from Shah Bano to Shaira Bano, Supreme Court has expressly refused to get involved in the issue of polygamy, that is 4 marriages allowed for Muslim men, and nikah halala. Nikah halala, I must tell you, to say the least, it surprises me, man. That if a Muslim husband confers oral talaq on his wife and in a fit of anger says talaq, talaq, talaq 3 times, or maybe because he is drunk, he blurts out talaq, talaq, talaq. Or maybe he did not get his alcohol that day, so he said talaq, talaq, talaq. Or informed her on WhatsApp or Facebook or even phone. Indian Muslims are told that divorce goes into action. And if the husband repents and he says, I'm sorry, I said it in fit of anger and I don't mean it, we want to stay together, then mullahs and maulvis say you can't. Now the marriage is broken. You can't also marry the same woman again. Mullahs say that that woman has to marry some other man first. Okay? That marriage has to be consummated. And then that man has to permit her to divorce again, and after that she can. This is called nikah halala. It's not a rare case where mullahs themselves have offered themselves for nikah halala. That in a fit of anger some marriage broke down and that man says, I want to continue my marriage with her. The mullah himself would say that I am offering you. But nikah halala, this is a horrible, from any point of view, from human point of view, from religious point of view, from social point of view. Among the most important ones is also justice for women, mind you. Equal justice for women. This is a horrible pratha, the system. But in cases from Shah Bano to Shaira Bano, Supreme Courts have steadfastly refused to say anything about this. But in the decision about Shaira Bano and 5 others case, and a directive to the government, and government officially sided with Muslim women in the Supreme Court. Accordingly, the law is about to be there. The movements, etc. are going on. There is a lobby that says that the punishment for 3 years of imprisonment is rather harsh. And maybe government in its wisdom chooses to discuss that and let it happen in a democratic fashion. But that, after a gap of like 30 plus years, the issue has come up again. One chance we had was 1985. How I personally keep thinking that had Rajiv Gandhi taken that chance, we would have had a different India today. We would have had a more integrated, a more egalitarian India with less communal strife within India today. That chance lost. I would like to say, I would like to think, that's my opinion also, that in Supreme Court decision in Shaira Banu and 5 others, the way government presented the case, and later on government has chosen to follow the directive of the Supreme Court, India is moving ahead. So in the same one, now there are cases pending before the Supreme Court, the cases pertaining to polygamy and nikah halala. So it remains to be seen how the constitutional system would then deliver. We have seen directive principles, their implementation. That brings us now into the arena of an inevitable conflict between directive principles and fundamental rights. That we know fundamental rights are important because they are statement of political democracy. And directive principles are no less, they are equally important. Maybe every once in a while someone may say they are actually more important because on August 15, we got political freedom. But that's only a means to an end. Our real goal is spelled out in part 4, that is directive principles of state administration. So part 3 and 4 are most important parts of the Constitution, all agreed. What if there is a conflict between the two? So which one will have primacy over the other? And conflict there is. Because Article 19, as a part of 7 freedoms, and a specific mention separately in Article 31 also conferred right to property as a fundamental right. So under any circumstances, government cannot pass laws which encroach upon or abrogate fundamental rights, irrespective of the doctrine of reasonable restrictions. So Article 13(2). And then directive, one of the most important directive principles is equitable distribution of wealth. And the part 4 mentions equitable distribution of wealth. After 1947, India generally followed the socialist path. That is generally considered as by default. Personally, I don't agree, but we are going to discuss that some other time. And then Congress also passed the resolution for socialistic pattern of society. So avoiding concentration of wealth, equitable distribution of wealth, and then in order to bring about equitable distribution of wealth, the requisite state intervention, every single thing meant encroachment on right to property. Now that fight begins and is going to consume our session tomorrow. प्रार्थना करूया.